Thank you, Justin, and welcome to all of you. As Justin said, I'm Denise Neary, Director of Judicial Education at Berkeley Judicial Institute, and I could make this a long story, but I'll make it short. Now that we have you here, we would love to have you back. So Justin will put in the chat information about Berkeley Judicial Institute so that you can join our mailing list and participate in more wonderful programs like this. I am delighted to welcome you to a conversation, the first conversation since publication of the book Debt's Grip, Risk and Consumer Bankruptcy. And it's a pleasure to briefly introduce our bankruptcy rockstar faculty. I could take all 75 minutes just talking about them. They might like that, but the audience might not enjoy it as much. So I will so briefly introduce them, and Justin will put their biographical links in the chat. Our moderator for today is Judge Erithe Smith, who is a bankruptcy judge in the Central District of California. There's so many things I could say about her, but I'll just choose this one. She's a graduate of the Berkeley Law School. She'll be joined by the three authors of Debt's Grip. They are Professor Pamela Foohey, who holds the Allen Post Professorship at the University of Georgia School of Law, Professor Bob Lawless, who's the Max Rowe Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and Professor Deb Thorne, Professor of Sociology at the University of Idaho. They have worked very carefully to put together a beautifully choreographed program about their book. We don't want to promise that there'll be time for questions because it is a choreographed program. But if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll do our best. So with all of that, let's get to it. Judge Smith, where will we start today?
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so honored to have been asked to moderate this program featuring three of the top bankruptcy law professors in the country and their new book, Debt's Grip, which, by the way, happens to be the #1 release in bankruptcy law on Amazon's list of hot new releases. This groundbreaking book takes a deep dive into the financial struggles, motivations, and challenges facing individuals both before and during their foray into the bankruptcy system. The professors, by the way, have indicated they prefer to be addressed by their first names, so I will honor that preference. Pamela, could you give our audience a brief overview or elevator pitch of the book, as well as a review of the table of contents?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So we first want to thank Denise Neary and the Berkeley Judicial Institute for having us and organizing this event, and also Judge Smith for so carefully reading Debt's Grip and moderating the session, and all of you for virtually attending. So Debt's Grip is the culmination of a decades-long project, and in it, we draw on 11 years of court records and surveys from the Consumer Bankruptcy Project to show the barriers to financial stability that households across the United States face. We like to say that the book provides a thick description of what it means to live in financial precarity in the United States today. And we have slides, which I'm going to share right now. And this is the cover of the book, which you should now see. And we think the cover provides a glimpse of what that life is like, that life of financial precarity. And as you can see, drawing on people's bankruptcy journeys allows us to document the systemic barriers to financial stability that they face, with a focus on particularly notable credit products and also particularly vulnerable populations. And the financial products are what you might imagine. So mortgages, car loans, medical debt, and student loans. And the populations are Black households, single women, some of whom have children, and also older households. A note about this slide. So if you use the QR code on the slide, it'll take you to the University of California Press's webpage for the book. And you can poke around there and learn more. And then if you are inclined to purchase the book, if you buy it through the press, the code on the slide will get you 30% off. That's the only plug we're going to make for the book besides talking about what's in it. So Judge Smith mentioned the table of contents. And instead of show you the table of contents, instead I'm going to talk about the book in 4 parts, and the 4 parts are shown on this slide. So the book is organized around people's stories, but it also is a story. The first portion starts with some background on bankruptcy and then turns to people's struggles. And that's the struggles to make ends meet while they're dealing with debt. The second part details those particularly notable credit products I mentioned: home loans, car loans, medical debt, student loans, and also unsecured debts incurred because of job loss, underemployment, or running a small business. The third part has 3 chapters in it, and those chapters detail the financial lives of the particularly vulnerable populations I mentioned, including how credit products show up in their lives. And the fourth portion focuses on law. 1 chapter overviews lawsuits and debt collection brought to bankruptcy, and another chapter looks for can-pay debtors, those people who might be what might be termed taking advantage of the system. So we don't have time to cover it all. Because the chapters that deal with credit products are featured in the chapters that talk about particularly vulnerable populations, we're going to focus particularly on demographics of bankruptcy filers, and we'll also talk about people's pre-bankruptcy struggles and debt collection, because those debt collection actions feature heavily in their struggles. And that's a bit of a roadmap of our time together. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Judge Smith.
Thank you. There are many great books that have been written on consumer bankruptcy. I think what makes this book particularly special and unique is that the authors explore the backstories of financially strapped individuals who find their way into the bankruptcy court system, highlighting perspectives that are often invisible to most of us bankruptcy judges, to bankruptcy professionals generally, and others outside the bankruptcy community. The book provides a highly textured account of the financial struggles of everyday folks by synthesizing anecdotal data with more than a decade of empirical data, while simultaneously analyzing the impact, both good and bad, of the current bankruptcy system. And this is done in a manner that is both scholarly and digestible to non-academics such as myself and perhaps many of you in attendance. With that, I will symbolically remove my #1 fan hat and get on with the program. Bob, for our participants who are not bankruptcy experts, what do they need to know about bankruptcy law in order to understand the book, or even this talk for that matter?
Yeah, so thank you. So first, let me also express my appreciation for being invited to do this, and appreciation for everybody's time to listen to us for a little while. So what you just talked about is a good segue to where I was going to start. So we pitched this to an undergraduate level. As we were writing the book, we kept reminding ourselves that a great use of the book would be an undergraduate seminar. So if you're not a bankruptcy expert, if you're not a statistics person, don't worry about it. The book's for you. We tried to avoid jargon. We tried to avoid heavy statistics. If you are one of those people, there's a great methodological appendix. You can thumb through it to your heart's content to get all the gory details of the methods that we used. In terms of what you need to know to understand the book, and really more the talk today, I'm guessing like a lot of people on the Zoom here are bankruptcy experts, but if you're not, like, here's what you need to know, right? Is that obviously the chief benefit of bankruptcy to a consumer is principally the discharge, the forgiveness of debts. Some debts are non-dischargeable, like taxes and child support and some other sorts of debts of that sort of nature. But mainly people file bankruptcy to get a discharge of their indebtedness, to be forgiven their debts. Getting a little bit into the details of the bankruptcy law, just very little bit, right? There's different chapters of bankruptcy law. There's Chapter 7, which is a liquidation chapter, where you turn over your assets to a trustee who sells them and distributes the proceeds to creditors. Spoiler alert, like 95% of the cases, there are no assets to distribute. So for those 95% of cases, Chapter 7 is like a quick trip through it's almost like an administrative proceeding, right? You file your papers, you answer some questions, and months later you get a discharge. Chapter 13 is the reorganization chapter, where you devote payment of your income from 3 to 5 years to paying off your past debts. Broadly speaking, and we always get, if you are a bankruptcy expert, you will quibble with this, right? But Chapter 7, generally speaking, is faster, cheaper, and you get broader relief. Chapter 13 is slower, more expensive. You get less relief. If you're a bankruptcy expert, you'll be saying, wait. There's all sorts of times when Chapter 13 is appropriate. That's absolutely right. But just as a broad portrait, right, you're generally going to want to be in Chapter 7 if you can. A way to think about this is Chapter 7 protects your future income, whereas Chapter 13 protects the assets you have on hand. So the bankruptcy system today is kind of set up that a filer needs to make that decision. Do I have lots of assets? If so, then I probably want to do Chapter 13. If I don't have a lot of assets, then I probably want to protect my future resources, which is my earning potential.
Thank you. And we've already mentioned that the book is a data-driven project. Can you tell us, Bob, what are the sources of the data?
Yes. So first, I really liked the way you introduced the book. One of the things, so we are a very data-driven group, but we added the narratives. I like to think of the narratives in the book as you put it, adding texture to the numbers that are there. So the book is driven off a very rigorous empirical project about consumer bankruptcy filers, but we use lots at the end of the survey that I'll talk about in a moment. We ask bankruptcy filers to, if they're willing to provide it, share their story with us, and they have a page to do so, and many people choose to do so, and those stories are scattered throughout the book. But the data themselves come from the Consumer Bankruptcy Project, which is a long-running project studying consumer bankruptcy filers going back to the 1980s. It was started by Elizabeth Warren and Jay Westbrook and Terry Sullivan. They did a lot of data collection in the 80s, and then in 91, and then in 2001, that's when Deb and I became involved in the project. And in 2013, we went to a continuous data collection method, where every 3 months we draw a national random sample of bankruptcy filers. And if you could see this screen over here, you would see me in progress drawing our national random sample for the next round. So we get a random sample of 200 bankruptcy filers. We go out, we collect their court records, we send those folks surveys. The book is based upon the court records and surveys we did from 2013 through 2023. That's 11 years of data. That's 8,800 court files and a little over 2,300 surveys that we got back from the people that we sent them to.
Thank you. That's a lot of data. And while the average person struggling financially may not intuitively associate their problems or the solution to their problems as legal in nature, the decision to file bankruptcy is indeed a legal one. And statistically, the most successful debtors are those with legal representation. So, Bob, can you comment on the attorney selection process?
Well, we'll quibble in a little while about whether the decision to file bankruptcy is a legal one. I think it is a legal one. I agree with you. It's legal, financial, it's psychological, it's sociological, and some of the data we're going to talk about are going to be about how people come to decide to file bankruptcy. So, the first thing to appreciate is that bankruptcy is expensive for the everyday people. Right? A private lawyer is going to cost you, national average right now, national medians. And actually something I should say, we're going to generally be using medians because we get outliers that skew the data. So when you hear us talk about numbers, we're going to be using medians. We're talking about the typical case, that case right in the middle. So median attorney's fee now for a private lawyer for a Chapter 7 is $1,450. There's a lot of geographic variation, but nationally, $1,450. For a Chapter 13, $4,600 to hire an attorney to do your Chapter 13, right? Chapter 13 is longer, it's more expensive, it's always been cost more. So we actually don't know a lot about how people find their attorneys. And I see we're coming up with the slide here that's going to show you our data. So we started asking people, how did you find your attorney? And here's what people told us. And I won't do the boring webinar thing of going through this line by line. You can all read that for yourselves, right? There is a lot of internet, which is not surprising, right? That's the top choice that people are searching on Google or Yelp, which fits a lot with anecdotal accounts from consumer bankruptcy attorneys about how people are finding them and the importance of Google and Yelp ratings in attracting clients. But one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is thinking about how a lot of this is serendipity. This is, so we don't know a lot about how people find their lawyers, but as you see on the slide, filing bankruptcy is an important decision. It's one of the most consequential, a very consequential decision for most people. And who they hire, there's a lot of serendipity there, right? It's just near home or work, right? Saw an ad on for the lawyer on television, internet, or a billboard. Amazingly, 28% of the people did not shop around for a lawyer. We do a lot of social science work, and people are often very reluctant to admit to the researcher that they've done something that might be viewed as undesirable or not careful, right? But 28% of the people will admit they didn't shop around for a lawyer. So there's a lot of serendipity there, and we'll have more to say about how people are brought to law. But what I think a takeaway here is the lawyer mediates the outcome between the person, right, and the law, right? And so who you have as a lawyer is going to determine a lot about the outcome you're going to get, and the decision about which lawyer to hire. Not everyone, but there's a lot of serendipity there about how that lawyer came to be hooked up with the bankruptcy filer.
Thank you. What is the financial profile of a typical bankruptcy filer? That is in terms of income, assets, debt, et cetera. And how does a particular profile play into chapter choice? That is Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13. And what debtor profile benefits most from a Chapter 13 versus Chapter 7?
Yeah, so I talked about the history of the Consumer Bankruptcy Project, and one of the kind of longstanding findings of the project going back to the 1980s. This was in many ways kind of the original insight of the project, is that the people who file bankruptcy are not the impoverished, right? There's, I think, a common conception among non-experts that people who file bankruptcy must be poor, but if you're truly below the poverty line, you don't have assets, you don't have debts, bankruptcy is not going to do anything for you. What we see is the idea of the fallen middle class, right? Deb will maybe elaborate a little bit, the idea of downward mobility, right? We see that in the bankruptcy filers. These are people who once had things but now don't. Our financial profile, and there's lots of data in the book. I've just tried to pull out some of the highlights here. $35,000 in assets. So again, these are not people without anything, but these are also by no means wealthy. Of course, the median total debts, they're deeply indebted, $101,000. Almost $50,000 of that is unsecured. Now I see we probably have an error there, right? So most of that, actually a good portion of that, is unsecured debt, right? The annual income, the income figure is correct. The debt figure is not. The annual income, these are not, again, people who are at the very bottom of the income distribution, but they're also not very far up in it. So again, kind of this theme of the kind of the people who once had things, downwardly mobile. You ask about financial profiles. Well, the common wisdom among bankruptcy experts is you file Chapter 13 to save a house, but that just comes out of the idea that Chapter 7 requires you to turn over assets. Chapter 13 protects those. So in theory, the financial profile that screams file Chapter 13 is somebody with a lot of assets that they would lose if they filed a Chapter 7. But it's not just assets. So There's something with also this comes out of the Consumer Bankruptcy Project over the years, the concept of local legal culture. So there's huge geographic variation on the percentage of cases that are filed as Chapter 13. So here's a map that we put together of the percentage of cases filed as Chapter 13. It's by county during the time of our data. And you'll see there's huge geographic variation. It's as high as 95% in some counties, mainly in the Deep South, but not exclusively in the Deep South. The Plain states, the percentage of bankruptcies that are Chapter 13s are often 10% or less. There's one thing the Constitution says about bankruptcy laws: that it shall be a uniform law of bankruptcy, and it may be a uniform law, but it's not a uniform system. How you experience bankruptcy, and take this back to some of the things what we know about lawyers and the importance of the lawyer determining the outcome. A lot of how you experience the federal bankruptcy system is going to depend a lot on where you live, and as this map shows.
Very interesting. Shifting gears just a little bit. There are racial disparities as to Black persons in education, employment, housing, and lending, which has been well documented. Moreover, empirical studies indicate that Blacks are frequently targeted for higher cost credit products and are more likely to be the subject of debt collection actions. Pamela, how have such disparities played out in the bankruptcy arena?
Great. So this is a good transition. Just as a reminder, we're skipping over the chapters that deal with each of the credit products, and now we're taking the general financial profiles of people and talking about each of the vulnerable populations that show up in bankruptcy, and playing off the map that was just shown. But I want to talk a little bit about the Black experience in the United States outside of bankruptcy, and then turn to how it plays out in bankruptcy. And I'll show you some financial data broken out by chapters and also by race. So as an initial matter, the Black experience in the United States is unique. And as Judge Smith noted, there's tons of research showing that Black persons pay more across credit products and also face disparities in housing, education, employment, and the legal system. And I note all of those because that's important for who uses bankruptcy. So what this part of the book does is two things. It first draws out the barriers that Black households who file bankruptcy face in the bankruptcy system itself, which goes along with that map you saw a little bit. But then it also connects the finances of bankrupt Black households to the racial wealth gap to highlight discrimination and how the placing of risk onto households is exacerbated for this group, which is a theme of this chapter and the next couple of chapters we're going to talk about. And I'm going to focus on how the disparities outside bankruptcy manifest in bankruptcy. They're evidence first in who files bankruptcy. So 14% of the population identifies as Black, but Black households make up 27% of the households that file bankruptcy. Their overrepresentation is offset by an underrepresentation of white households among filers. Black households are also much more likely to file Chapter 13 than households with other demographics. Right? About half of Black households filed Chapter 7, the other half filed Chapter 13. If you look at households of other demographics, they file Chapter 7 75% of the time, and Chapter 13 a bit over 25% of the time. We're not going to discuss chapter choice other than noting the disparity, because it means it's important to detail what happens in these bankruptcies disaggregated by chapter. And when I put up the next slide with finances, it's going to have Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 in two different columns. So Black households bring with them to bankruptcy the barriers they find to financial stability outside of bankruptcy out across the country. However, the barriers are exacerbated for them, and that shows up in the finances that they bring to bankruptcy as compared to other households that file. Okay, so I'm going to bring back up the slides, and I want to talk about the finances of households along three items: houses, cars, and student loans. And I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, so I'm going to highlight those three items in turn, starting with homes. So owning homes and the mortgage market over the decades are perhaps the biggest contributor to the racial wealth gap in the United States. And across the country, the Black homeownership rate remains notably less than the white homeownership rate. Houses in predominantly Black neighborhoods are consistently undervalued, and Black homebuyers are sold subprime, more expensive loans on their homes, even if they qualify for less expensive loans. This affects the final sale prices for homes, how much Black homeowners pay through debt to ultimately own their homes, and thereby it affects wealth accumulation. And among bankruptcy filers, these disparities are visible in the fact that Black filers are less likely to own homes, which you can see here. And in Chapter 7, you can see the higher cost of housing debt in lower home equity. Okay, so it shows up in bankruptcy. The second thing I want to highlight is cars. In many ways, the car market is similar to the housing market. And this market also reflects barriers in access to other consumer credit markets faced by Black consumers. So Black car purchasers are sold more expensive cars, and they're also sold more expensive car loans. Among bankruptcy filers, the disparities can be seen in their finances and the higher total value of the cars owned by Black filers as compared to other filers, and the lower equity held by filers, which is on account of the higher amount of car loans owed on the cars that they own. This is particularly noticeable in Chapter 13, in which the median Black filer owns negative equity in their car. Right? So the car is worth less than the amount that they owe on it. The final thing I want to talk about is student loans. Okay. The effects of disparities in the education market show up in a greater likelihood of Black filers entering bankruptcy owing on student loans. So they're more likely to have student loans when they enter bankruptcy. And then they owe more student loan debt if they have loans, as you can see here. Research shows that Black students are more likely to take out student loans, and then when they do, they owe more on their student loans, which imports directly into bankruptcy filings. The final item on this slide, which I'm not going to highlight, goes with income and employment. So there's well-documented income and employment disparities outside bankruptcy that cause Black persons to earn less overall. We included it on this slide, but you're going to see that Black filers overall, once you collapse Chapter 7 and 13, have about the same income as other filers. Nonetheless, Black filers have exacerbated stressors on their incomes, which they write about and tell us about on the survey. Some of which are higher cost loans, they have increased debt collection, and that includes a higher incidence of car repossession. This all amounts to increased struggles and ultimately turning to the bankruptcy system for help. Deb's going to talk about these struggles, and these struggles also are a good segue into the next chapter about women filing bankruptcy.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela. And yes, some might be surprised to learn that women comprise the largest demographic group in bankruptcy. That is 58%, including joint and individual petitions, and twice as many single women as single men file bankruptcy. Finally, the filing rate for Black single women is higher than single women generally. So what accounts for the disparity between single women filers and single men filers? And what accounts for the higher filing rate for Black single women versus non-Black single women?
Yeah, so this all goes together, and talking about Black filers in general and then transitioning to Black single women and single women generally makes a lot of sense. And that's why the book has the chapters in sequence. To set the stage, here's the exact filing percentages, disaggregated by relationship status and also by race. The percentages of women filing bankruptcy makes single women the largest demographic group in bankruptcy. And you can see here that single Black women are more likely to file than single white women. Women have been the largest demographic group in bankruptcy since 2001 and has remained relatively constant since then. The roots of the change in women's filing trace, we think, to changes in household economics that started in the 1970s. Women began to join the workforce, more women pursued higher education, and also marriage patterns began to shift. And the shift overall affected women differently based on socioeconomics and race. And it intersects with bankruptcy filings in an interesting way. So those women and men who are less likely to get married and also stay married are of the socioeconomic bands that generally turn to the bankruptcy system because of financial reasons. And what happens is, again, evident in their finances, and it's also evident in the household structure that they bring into bankruptcy. So I'm first going to talk about the household structure. The household structure is visible in terms of the dependents that the adults who file bring with them to bankruptcy. Single women are 50% more likely to have dependents in their households than single men. And when we say dependents, it truly is children in the household and tends to be children under the age of 18 in the household. If you look at this chart, you also see that single Black women are twice as likely to have children in their household as compared to single Black men. And it's that intersection of being a single parent, and who typically is the woman, that puts a strain on the family structure finances. And overall, everything would be fine, except for the fact that the increased barriers that women face in education and employment, combined with their caregiving responsibility, puts strain on their ability to make their finances meet the demands of the economics of their lives. This again shows up in the finances of single women filers, meaning what they come to bankruptcy with in terms of assets and debts, and also what they tell us about their struggles. And I want to talk about finances again and put up a very similar table as before. And I want to highlight two of the same items that I mentioned along with Black households that file bankruptcy. First, I want to talk about student loans, where we left off with the Black households. So women students outside of bankruptcy are more likely to take out loans than men. Single women, regardless of race, are more likely to enter bankruptcy owing student loans. And you can see here that overall single women owe more in student loans when they have student loans when they come to bankruptcy. You can also see here that Black women are driving the disparity. They are more likely to have higher student loan debt when they enter bankruptcy. And that reflects the intersection of race and gender in the education loan market and goes along with what we talked about regarding the higher debt rate of Black students. The second item I want to talk about is homes, which is something we also talked about with Black filers. But it's different with single women. So single women are more likely to enter bankruptcy as homeowners than single men, which might surprise you. But outside of bankruptcy, single women are also more likely than single men to own homes. So they just import that into bankruptcy with them. And this owning of homes links with having dependents, children in their household, which goes along with women's caregiving responsibilities, which puts a strain on their budget. And it's a fixed cost that they want to keep. They want to keep the home for their children. So what we didn't include on this slide is income, just for space reasons. But as before, single women have about the same income as single men when they file. Indeed, single Black women have higher income than single Black men. However, women still face barriers in the workplace, particularly around navigating their caregiving responsibility. And their income has to stretch much further. It has to cover childcare expenses, has to cover those fixed homeownership costs. That their income has to stretch further is evident in what single women go without and try to do to make ends meet before they file bankruptcy. And we call these coping mechanisms and privations. Deb's going to talk more about people's overall struggles before bankruptcy. I'm going to foreshadow that by saying, notably, single women with children in their household will struggle for longer with their debt before they file bankruptcy. They'll go without even more than single women without children in their homes while still trying to prioritize their children. And they'll do more before they file to try to stay financially afloat. And finally, what stands out about the women who file bankruptcy is the stories that they write to us about the domestic and financial abuse that they suffered at the hands of their partners before they filed and was part of their filing. They typically write most about how their partners had put all the debts in their name, which after they had left the situation, left them with no choice but to file bankruptcy. With that, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, and thank you very much for that information, which is very interesting and very sobering also. Shifting gears to another demographic, back in the day, and by that I mean the 1970s or earlier, it was presumed that folks would retire at 65 and live comfortably on employer-sponsored pensions, Social Security, Medicare, and whatever savings they were able to accumulate. However, since the 1980s, pensions have dwindled or shifted to being the sole responsibility of individual employees, and Social Security and Medicare benefits are generally insufficient to cover basic housing, food, and healthcare costs. Deb, can you expand on how the golden age of retirement somehow morphed into the bankruptcy age of retirement? And why senior filings are on an upward trend? Also, is the filing profile for seniors different from that of younger filers? For example, in terms of health issues and costs, ageism regarding employment opportunities, the lack of sufficient retirement savings, etc.
Sure. Thank you, Judge Smith. Yes, the social scientists will refer to the golden age of bankruptcy is the last half of the 20th century. At that time, there were, like you said, there were adequate, Social Security was adequate, healthcare was adequate, and pensions were more available, particularly for white males. But there were pensions, and that's a magic thing about pensions. I don't have one. Many people don't have one anymore, and they will continue for the rest of your life after you retire, whereas a 401k, you're not guaranteed that. What happened, though, often most of this is beginning in the 1980s, is that there were policy changes that occurred, and it was policy, it was intentional policy that made Social Security less secure. For example, Social Security used to be 50% of your pre-retirement income. That was decreased to 40%. And then the penalty for early withdrawal, if you started taking your Social Security early, increased from 20% to 30% in about 1983. The expenses that are associated with Medicare, I mean, of course, Medicare is better than nothing. And it covers many things. But for example, it does not cover hearing aids. It doesn't cover vision. Most consequential for many of our respondents, it doesn't cover dental. And then again, we had that transition from pensions to 401ks, where they're managed by the individual. I don't know, but most of us don't. I don't, and most of you, I expect, don't have much training in retirement investments. So it's managed by individuals, and individuals usually are the ones that are deciding if they're going to contribute. It's not something that the employer does without them. And we believe that these policy shifts were really drove what we're seeing in the increase in senior filers. Let's see, click to the next slide. So what I want you to focus on here, I've highlighted. We've got the age groups. Look at, we've got the seniors along the bottom, 65 and over, and by the years of data collection. So if we go back to 2001, and we had good census data for comparison with back then too. So I want to go back to that year and compare to the second half of our data collection, 2018 to 2023. And we see that in 2001, seniors comprised 4.5% of the entire bankruptcy population, or population of bankruptcy filers. In the last half of our data collection for our book between 2018 and 2023, they had elevated the percent of filers who were seniors in the bankruptcy population had increased to 18.7% over what, 2021, 20-year period. That's a 315% increase. And some people will say, well, but in general, the population in the United States has gotten older, and absolutely it has. We are an aging population. But that, when you account for that, that's only 43%. That is only a 43% income increase in the United States population, whereas in the bankruptcy population, we've seen a 315% increase. If we take a look at the financials for these folks, it's just not good. People who are seniors, their average annual income is right around $37,000 a year. That's only $3,000 a month. That's including their Social Security and their retirement and anything they have coming in from, if they have accounts from their savings. For people who are under 65, their average income or their median income is $47,000. Now, you would expect that they're in their earning prime of sorts. One of the real pickles, though, particularly for older people, is if you look at their unsecured debt, they're carrying almost what they would have in income in a year in their unsecured debt. Same for people who are under 65, but the pickle is people who are under 65 are more likely to be employed and are more likely to have, and not more likely, but they have years. If they didn't file bankruptcy, they would have years to try to repay that money that they owed. Older people don't have years, lots of years left. And then finally, we see that in retirement savings, seniors on average have nothing. 65 and over, our filers have zero in their retirement accounts. Now, so do the median amount, so do people who are under 65. But again, they could have decades, at least trying to get something in their retirement accounts. Seniors don't have decades left. If we take a look at what happened, I'm going to wrap it up really quick because I'm out of time. But if we take a look at what happened, why did they file? 70% of them said that they had no money. They didn't have adequate money. And where did that come from? They maybe are no longer employed, but they also said they didn't have adequate Social Security. Here's the other part that they're really running up against, is that they didn't have retirement savings, and many of them stripped their 401ks. before they filed and tried to pay off their debts. The other reason they filed is because of medical bills or work they missed because they were ill or injured. They talk about even with Medicare, they still had deficiencies in what would be covered. And then for many of them, they said they had declining health and they couldn't continue to work any longer. So I guess my takeaway is the fresh start is kind of rings hollow for people who are seniors. Their debts certainly have been erased, but they're not going to have time to rebound. We can't give them their youth back and we can't give them their health back. And it's unlikely they're going to be hired. So it's a real pickle for our senior filers.
Yeah, those are certainly very serious and unsettling circumstances facing our seniors, and we can only hope that this book can help open minds, at least, to considering real solutions for this particular demographic.
Yeah.
I just want to shift a little bit to the concept of financial precarity, which is discussed in the book.
Yes.
As a common thread among bankruptcy filers. Staying with you, Deb, can you explain what that means and how it manifests itself in the lives of individuals struggling to survive? And why do academics call this time the sweat box? And finally, what strategies do persons experiencing financial precarity typically employ to stave off bankruptcy? And how does such strategies influence a person's ultimate decision to file for bankruptcy relief?
Of course. So financial precarity is, think about living your life on the tip of the point of a needle financially. And it's not like it's like if you're on the edge of a cliff and financial cliff as well. And it's not like you're a couple feet back, but you're right on the edge. And if anything goes wrong, it's curtains for you financially. And that's where many of the people who file bankruptcy have spent several years before they file. If something, gosh, heaven forbid, the transmission go out on the car. Maybe a kid breaks their arm, which I think that's fairly common, that children get hurt and when they're young. Or if you lose hours at your job. And those types of things that many of us could weather. They cannot. That's financial precarity. Now, transition a little bit to what is the sweat box, which is a term that's commonly used in the years prior to filing for bankruptcy. It's like a pressure cooker is another way to think about it, is that you can't get away because you owe so much money and you cannot escape your creditors. They are threatening to garnish your wages, or they do garnish your wages. They're threatening to foreclose on your home. They're threatening to repossess your car. It's a time, it's like you're living in financial hell and you can't get out of it. So it's those years prior to filing. Here we go. This is the time that they spent in that sweat box. And we broke it down by how long did they spend in there. So we had short strugglers who spent less than 6 months, modest strugglers who spent up to 2 years, and then long strugglers, people who have my heart, are people who spent 2 to more than 5 years. And if you look at 2027, our comparison years for this, to our data collection, to our sample, the short strugglers are holding fairly constant. But where we're seeing a real uptick in a movement is modest strugglers are shrinking some, and that movement is up. People are moving into the long struggler category. So where we had 44% were long strugglers in 2007, now we're up to 63% are long strugglers in our sample. So these are people who are spending an inordinate amount of time in that sweat box, where they're doing everything they can to not just make ends meet, because I think that most of them, they can't make their ends meet, but they're just doing what they can to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Let's see, the financial characteristics. This is really unfortunate. I mean, you can see what happens, right? Your total assets, if you're a short struggler, you're carrying right around 40 grand in assets. But if you're a long struggler, that has decreased to about $29,000. I also would like you to look at their annual income. The income of long strugglers is a little bit lower, but here's the most important part, is that bottom line. Long strugglers, they're sacrificing. They owe 2 years, 3 months worth of income, 2 years, 5 months of their income to pay off their debts. Whereas people who are modest strugglers and short strugglers wouldn't owe nearly that much. Their debt to asset ratio, while not good, is certainly not as bad as long strugglers. So long strugglers have certainly sacrificed financially. Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at what they did, what coping strategies they did, and this kind of ties into why we look at why their financials were so bad. The people on the black line were long strugglers, but we see that they're taking out their retirement funds, which is what I mentioned with older people. They're stripping money from their retirement funds. Those long strugglers are paying a price. They are taking out payday loans. They're borrowing from family. The one thing that they are doing that wouldn't be increasing their debt is they're working more. It doesn't seem to be paying off. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about their privations, and these are the things they go without. This is hard. Long strugglers, you see that they're suffering even in another realm, and that is what they go without. More than 3/4 are going without health care, compared to not only, right? Only 50% of short strugglers. This dental care that they go without comes up again and again and again throughout our respondents. That's what young people, old people, and middle-aged people who file for bankruptcy are going out without, is dental care. Of course, they're going out without therapy. And long strugglers are more likely to pay their rent or mortgage late. And then finally, they're more likely to strip their retirement savings. And I've gone just a smidge over, but when we ask them, did they have physical or mental problems that were increased because of the stress of the debt? More than half of the respondents said that they did. We had more than 1,000 descriptions of physical and mental distress that they experienced because of the stress of the debts. I've got one final 2-line quote. Attempted suicide, which resulted in spleen removal and an extended stay in the hospital and in the psychiatric ward, untreated depression and anxiety, and alcoholism. This was a result of living in that sweatbox. And the longer you spent, the worse it got. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Deb, too. Shifting gears just a little bit, in terms of debt collection, unsecured debt collection is often cited by debtors as a precipitating factor in making the decision to finally file bankruptcy. Debtors complain of the usual activities, persistent dunning letters, phone calls, texts, emails, and other communications through social media. And of course, more formal collection efforts involve threats of foreclosure and repossessions of automobiles, etc. Bob, just how does the debt collection process work?
Yeah, so I think, kind of in the interest of time, I think this audience is probably pretty familiar with the formal efforts we've already been mentioned, garnishment and the like. And I guess I'd like to just stress 2 things in terms of how it works right now. Is first, never forget the importance of informal efforts, right? The phone call, the dinner time phone call, the dunning calls, that sort of stuff. As lawyers, we often tend to forget that that's the first attempt, right? It's not the legal lawsuit, but the the informal efforts, but also even more so, I want to stress the debt collection industry's changed over the last few decades. Right? Information technology has transformed it. The industry has become restructured. Debts that would formerly not have been profitable to pursue through formal debt collection has changed. So my favorite law faculty lounge parlor game is to ask my colleagues over lunch, what's the most common lawsuit in the United States today? And you get all sorts of a car accident, all sorts of guesses. And the answer is it's a debt collection action for about $400. It's not even close. Right? I'd recommend an article for people who are interested in this topic by Daniel Wilf Townsend in the Harvard Law Review called Assembly Line Plaintiffs. And when I have a moment, I'll put that citation in the chat. It documents really the changes in the debt collection industry and what's happening in the state courts and how more and more people are being sued for debt collection than would have been true 3 or 4 decades ago. And
Okay.
then if you
I'm
want to
sorry.
talk I can maybe talk a little bit about how common debt collection is. And I know we have a slide on that as well with the data
Yes.
about, so not surprisingly, people who are in bankruptcy have or tend to have a lot of debt collection. So this slide has 2 data sources on it. So the top part is from the survey where we ask people about what might have happened before bankruptcy. And then the bottom is the lawsuits that are actually disclosed in the bankruptcy court records. So one big difference between the top and the bottom is the top picks up that informal debt collection, the phone calls, et cetera, that the formal bankruptcy records do not pick up. And again, right, lots of debt collection, very common with bankruptcy filers. But then here, the big takeaway here is let's build on what Deb talked about with people struggling and people waiting. And this will take us back to the beginning, Judge Smith, where you and I were quibbling about bankruptcy's decision being a legal one, right? Like the next slide shows, right? You want to think about how people come to decide to file bankruptcy. So in the socio-legal literature, there's a well-known concept called naming, blaming, and claiming. You've been injured, right? You got to name who caused you the harm. You got to conceptualize it as a legal claim, and then actually bring that claim to formal process. Bankruptcy isn't really about a harm, but these people still go through the same process, right? They have to conceptualize their problems as legal ones, right? You know, that you can't pay your bills. A lot of people, I don't think, will immediately think of, well, I have a legal problem because I don't have to pay my bills. And we think, we hypothesize, we don't have direct evidence of this, but all the evidence is consistent with this, that a lot of the law strugglers would have just kept on struggling, and they're, quote, brought to law. Their creditors reconceptualize their their problem for them as a legal one. What was a financial problem, I need more money, I need to pay my debts, becomes a legal one. You see that people, that the longer they struggle, the more likely they're to have been sued in the year before bankruptcy. And then for all those of you on the webinar and have held out, this is new. The bottom part's new, it's not in the book. People who were sued in the year before bankruptcy are much more likely to use an attorney. People who use an attorney are much more likely to have been sued in the year before bankruptcy than people who don't, right? They were going along with their financial problems, they got sued. This now says to them, maybe what I have here is not a financial problem, but a legal problem.
Okay, thank you. And as we wrap things up very quickly, Deb, what is the Great Risk Shift, or GRS? Do you think it has explanatory power for your findings in the book?
Thank you for asking that. I think it is at the core of our book. It is often, we talk about how the Great Risk Shift is a term that was introduced by Jacob Hacker. He's a political scientist at Yale, amazing writer. And what he talks about is because of what I kind of referenced to earlier, is because of policy changes, particularly in the 80s, financial responsibilities that used to be managed by corporations, employers, and the government. For example, healthcare, retirement pensions, and so on, even funding higher education, that used to be managed by larger entities have been shifted off to individuals. The financial risk of so many things in our lives have been shifted off onto us as individuals. And the result is a lot of profit for people who don't have to carry that responsibility anymore, but a lot of personal risk for us. And the 401k is the ultimate example. From pensions to a 401k, that we have to take on that responsibility. And it leaves us incredibly and increasingly vulnerable. And that's what we talk about in large part in the book, is this is a result of social financial precarity for individuals that has been manifested intentionally and knowingly over the last 50 years, 45 years or so. And that, in large part, is what is at the core of our book.
Bob, how can the structure of the bankruptcy system be improved to better serve its consumer constituents?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't set out to write a book just about the bankruptcy system, but it has obvious implications for it. There's the Consumer Bankruptcy Reform Act introduced by Senator Warren and Representative Nadler that would combine Chapter 7 and 13 and make kind of a more streamlined, unified process. I think there's a lot of merit to that. I always feel I have to say, full disclosure, I was consulted and helped work on that, but I think there's a lot of good reasons why some sort of big reform like that would make a lot of sense. It'd make things cheaper. But let me just throw out the possibility that Congress is maybe not going to undertake a big reform of the bankruptcy system. I'm going out on a limb here, by which I mean I'm not going out on a limb at all, right? There are smaller things that I think can make some huge differences. We can talk more maybe here in Q&A about those if people are interested. But I think we should modify the rules and payments to lawyers, allow consumer debtors to pay their attorney's fees over time, so we don't have the chapter choice being driven by perhaps the prospect of paying your fees through a Chapter 13 plan. I think we need to modify the bankruptcy code to provide a reasonable pathway to the dischargeability of student loans, right? Bankruptcy is a kind of a bespoke, can you repay your debts, right? Bankruptcy is not a free ride. If you can pay, bankruptcy makes you pay. And the bankruptcy system could be a very good pathway to try to deal with some of the student loan problem, which comes up again and again in our data.
Thank you. And finally, Pamela, could certain national and/or industry policy changes make things even worse at this point?
Well, thank you, Judge Smith, and that's a great question to end on. And I'm gonna answer it by taking a step back and doing a little bit of wrap up as well. And to wrap in what Bob and Deb said, ultimately, we wrote a book that is about bankruptcy, but it's actually not all that much about bankruptcy. Like the last two words of the title are or three words are and consumer bankruptcy. And we meant to do that, and it happened that we did that in the title as well. And the book really shows the social and economic fault lines in the United States, and how the last 2 and 3 generations have seen risks that were once spread more broadly, now loaded onto the individual. And the result of that is the accumulation of unmanageable debt. And that's the result of national policy changes and industry policy changes that were allowed to happen. And the people who file bankruptcy will benefit from having their debts discharged. That'll give them some time. Changes to bankruptcy laws are important, but that's not going to solve life's problems. And so as you read through the chapters, you'll find that we nod to bankruptcy in the chapters and at the ends of many chapters. And then we say there can be tweaks to bankruptcy, but we really talk about what has happened over time and what needs to be solved, because bankruptcy is not going to help people save for retirement in the face of the rising cost of everyday necessities and the rising cost of healthcare that they'll face when they exit the bankruptcy system. And for women, filing bankruptcy is not going to solve entrenched gender disparities. It's not going to help them lower the cost of childcare, pay less for education, and deal with pay gaps. Same thing for Black persons. They're going to face credit discrimination, housing discrimination, and education discrimination, and Black women will still suffer from the intersections of these discriminations. But of course, to Judge Smith's question, national and industry policy changes can make things worse than they already are. Notably, the continued stripping and destruction of Medicaid and Medicare will make it harder for people to make ends meet and financially survive. That could lead eventually to increased bankruptcy filings. Think about what Deb talked about how long people struggle with their debts before they file bankruptcy. It also mentioned that the potential for companies to run afoul of laws and regulations always remains. And that's why it's important for there to be government agencies, federal and state, to look for potential abuses, to set forth rules that make markets work for people, and to enforce laws and regulations, and maybe for there actually to be laws and regulations. And taking away those agencies and harming their effectiveness is going to hurt people. It actually could drive up the cost of credit for people, and it's ultimately going to serve to make life more expensive and will funnel people into bankruptcy. Because at its core, what debt script is meant to show, and what we hope it does show, is how the United States leaves people to struggle financially. And that leaves us with about 10 minutes, a little under 10 minutes, I think.
Okay. And I have to say that is why I think debt script is such an important time at this time in our nation's history. And we've covered a lot of territory this afternoon, but there is so much more in the book that we just could not address in the time allotted. So I want to encourage everyone in attendance to purchase the book. It will be well worth your while. I don't know, at this point, do we have any questions from those in attendance, or we have a few minutes for that?
So shockingly, the questions were able to be addressed during the chat, but we didn't really encourage questions. So I will let's do a brave thing. People have the ability to unmute. If there's a pressing question, we've got one right now. What characteristics do long strugglers have versus those who struggle for less time? And Deb, I think that you would be the most likely person to talk about that.
Primarily, we were looking at the financial characteristics, and those were, of course, up in the slide. Pamela and Bob, can you guys think of any other characteristics that we broke that out by?
Yeah, I mean, I can't. So you what we call the privations, right? The questions about what did you do? That's our internal shorthand for the questions to say, what did you do without? So people who struggle longer have more of those. We also, with what we call internally the coping mechanisms, what did you do to try to make ends meet? People who struggle have more of those, which goes back to this idea that of the sweat box, right? That this is the time, the financial firms are sweating you, right? You're running up fees, you're running up costs. You as a consequence are doing more things and doing without more because of that time. So, that's, I guess that to me, that's always the kind of big takeaway on the long struggle. I agree, like there's a lot of asset depletion, a lot of running up of debt, the numbers show that. But I think for me, it's almost always more that the privations and what coping strategies are greater. That's what makes it the sweat box. It's not so much the numbers, it's that qualitative decline of quality of life.
I'll add in, and this goes off of one of the questions about homeowners, although it doesn't answer the question about dependents. But what struggles, and what Bob ended with about being brought to law, is that homeowners tend to struggle slightly less. So they're slightly less likely to be in the long struggle category. And that links with foreclosure actions. And so when there's a foreclosure action, it triggers that something legal is going to happen, and the way to keep your home is to file bankruptcy. And so to your question, Victoria, about how do we encourage people not to struggle for so long? My answer would not be sue them and threaten to take their main asset away. But it turns out sue them and threaten to take the asset they live in away is to make them not struggle for so long.
And
Yeah, I
another
think
thing
it's,
I want to add
go
is
ahead.
that long strugglers report much higher rates of shame. So what characteristics, those are, more at a micro level, but they're much more likely to experience shame, and they're more likely to experience guilt. So there might be something going on also, it appears to be something going on at that level, very personal level, is that it is embarrassing to have to go through that.
I will just kind of tag onto that question. Do you think that maybe more or better or more extensive public education for persons to know what their options are sooner? In other words, that maybe they won't have to struggle so long if they understand how they could benefit from filing a bankruptcy, notwithstanding the shame and the embarrassment that goes with it. But maybe there are things that the bar can do, or that even courts can do by way of outreach and public education.
No. No, and the reason I think that, so there's already, right, if you watch TV, if whether you still watch TV with ads, I guess I still do, right? There's ads for bankruptcy, you drive around, right? There's billboards. People are aware. I'd be interested to see if my colleagues dissent from this, and I'd especially be interested in Deb's perspective, because, again, I like to say, it's much a sociological as psychological decision as a financial and legal one. I think what would benefit would make people more likely to see the attorneys, and right, and consumer bankruptcy attorneys will tell you, right, people wait too long. It is to know that they're not alone. Like, the number of people that file bankruptcy is large, and this is the social barriers need to be broken down. I don't think it's really a problem of information, legal and financial information.
And I don't even know. I happen to agree with Bob with his no answer. But one of my favorite demographics or groups in this population, and I make no bones about it, is people my age, right? It's us seniors. And the reason I have so much empathy for them is that they're not going to be able to recover. And the fact that they stripped their retirement accounts, if they had known differently, had we reached out to them and they've been able to educate them not to do that, would it have mattered? If they have to decide between a surgery that Medicare won't cover and chronic pain, they're going to take it out of their 401ks. And I just don't know we're in the education industry, but gosh, I don't know if it would have mattered. I think the solutions, to answer one of the questions in here, are providing adequate resources for people. Don't put them in a 401k. Provide pensions. Make sure they have health care. That said, people will tell you that it was a blessing, if you use that word, when they first met with the attorney and they were so ashamed, and their attorney said, "Don't worry, there's nothing to be ashamed of. This isn't your fault." I don't know if they could hear that message earlier, but I don't know if there's a way to reach out to that, Judge Smith.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to say that it won't move the needle for anyone, because I think it would, but it's not going to have, I think, the big effect that like lawyers think. It's the old studies about, what makes people conserve energy is knowing how much energy their neighbor uses. Right. And I think it's the same dynamic that if people understand that these are problems throughout the community,
right,
you're no different than anyone else. That's what would really move the needle.
So we are right at time. So I hate to be that person, but I will say there's a plea. Would you be willing to share the slides? Could we post those on the Berkeley Judicial Institute website?
Sure.
Oh, yay that, yay that. Then I'm going to, I hope, start and end by saying thank you. I'm grateful to my colleague Justin. I've been lucky enough to know Judge Smith for a long time, and all during the program, I thought, man, is she a good moderator? But she couldn't be such a good moderator if she didn't have this fantastic faculty. One of the things that I've been delighted about through my career, and I know you're all really fascinated by what matters to me, is how many smart, engaged people look at bankruptcy and look at it from the point of view of how can we make life better for people? And so thank you to all of you for doing that. Thanks to everyone who was in the audience. I will say that some of my favorite people on the planet might be in the audience today. And just assume that it's you, if you're not certain, if I mean you. Assume that it's you. Thanks to all of you for your time and for your energy. We're really grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
all.
much.
Thank you.